November 11th, Remembrance Day 2007. Bruce, he'd since finished his tour of duty, his third tour of duty in Afghanistan. He came to Ottawa. He's based in Halifax, but he came to Ottawa to attend the Remembrance Day ceremony, and I asked him if he would come to the studio and sit, and he did. He came and spent an afternoon with me in the studio so I could paint him from life. And I think you can see in the, there are a couple of works in the background. You'll see the finished paintings, but those are, he was sitting in front of a couple of the works that I had in progress. Someone earlier in the morning mentioned about the tattoos, and the one thing, Bruce was the head ward nurse, and he'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan. And when he came back from this third tour, he had a tattoo made and placed on his heart. And it had the medical symbol and a helmet and the number 39. And it's because Bruce attended 39 ramp ceremonies. And as far as he was concerned, that was it. He wasn't going to attend any more. That it was so, I think, so painful for him, having done the 3 tours and having witnessed that. He knew many of those fallen in Afghanistan. And I think this is my way of paying tribute to these people. Again, this is the first day in surgery. Aziz, anesthetist, the surgical nurse, and the surgeon. I call this one morning rounds because, of course, every morning everyone was involved. All the doctors, nurses, medical technicians, they were all involved. And that's what really impressed me, was how they all worked together as a unit. And no one was more important than the next. They all played a role. Mohammed Hussein, having an X-ray taken. You can see from my paintings, I'm most interested in the slow recovery. The slow recovery comes after the sudden trauma. And I know that sometimes the sudden trauma is a lot more dynamic in lots of ways. I realize that the sudden trauma does lead to a very, very slow recovery in months, in many cases, and of course years for some people. And what I'm interested in is painting the people, these behind-the-scenes people, who are willing to change that dressing 100 times or clean the tracheotomy of a patient over and over and over again. They're not glamorous things at all, but they're absolutely critical in the healing of these patients. And I think in my art, it's these small gestures that are of interest to me. This is Joanne Nadiak, she's a medevac nurse. Again, this is showing, to me, shows the dedication of these nurses, because I met Joanne in Kandahar and then invited her to come to the studio to sit. And again, she came and sat for her portrait in 2008 when she was being awarded a medal by General Hillier for her services as a medevac nurse. And Joanne did 2 tours of Afghanistan. When she came back to Canada, she's in the reserves. She was based in Trenton, continued work as a medevac nurse, and up until just a month or 2 ago, she was responsible for flying to Germany to the hospital in Landstuhl to collect injured Canadian soldiers and bring them back to Canada. So, as I say, it's people like that that I really think should be recognized and immortalized, and that's one of the gifts, I think, that artists have, that we can do this for these people. Because they don't ask for recognition. Maybe we're thrusting it upon them in some cases, but I think it's really, to me, it's really important. Again, this is a portrait of nurses during morning rounds, and the nurse in the foreground, the blonde, Nori, came to sit at the studio for me for this portrait. I knew how I wanted the portrait to look. But she was the one of the 5 that was able to come to the studio, and she was 7 months pregnant at the time. She'd since finished her tour, had come back to Canada, got married, and was pregnant, and she could barely do up she couldn't do up her uniform, but kindly came and modeled for me at the studio for this portrait. Colonel Mackay, the head of the hospital, with a gunshot wound victim, another Afghan civilian. And here's little Matslifa. I did want to just explain about Matslifa, was that with her leg, they thought they were going to have to amputate her leg. You can imagine an 8-year-old girl without a leg in Afghanistan isn't worth very much. And they tried and tried to do everything they could to have, hoping the leg would heal, and it wasn't healing. They were going to amputate it, and it was Bruce, the portrait I did of Bruce Reeves that you saw earlier, as the nurse, he suggested an old-fashioned skin graft method that they might try, which was to make an incision on the healthy leg and bind her legs together at the ankle. And for 3 weeks, she was like that with her legs together at the ankles, and the skin grew from the healthy leg to cover the wound on the wounded leg. For 3 weeks, she was like that. I was in the hospital the day that Matslifa walked out of the hospital, and it really was a miracle. And these are the things I think that keep the nursing staff, all of the medical staff going, is these kinds of miracles. This is the largest painting I did. Again, one of the challenges for me was working on a much larger scale than I'm used to, but I really felt it was such an important subject that it really deserved a large size. And for me, its largest canvas is 5 feet by 7.5 feet, and it shows the ward scene of the Royal 3 Hospital. It was Canadian-led at the time. This hospital no longer exists. There's been a brand new hospital built by the Americans, run by the Americans now in Kandahar. This was just literally, quite literally, a plywood shack. But in this painting, I show Toby, one of the nurses, cleaning the tracheotomy of a blast victim, and he had complete jaw reconstruction. 19-year-old young man. And in the distance are the other blast victims, because of course that was mainly blast victims and gunshot wound victims in the hospital. And of course you'll all be familiar, you've heard stories about Tim Hortons, so I wanted to include Tim Hortons because this was probably the only beacon of hope for, or rather beacon of comfort, I should say, for the medical staff. Every day someone would be sent to go to Tim Hortons to buy coffee and donuts for the staff. And this is the image that Dr. Brandon was mentioning, my self-portrait on Hercules. And as a reluctant traveler, I have to admit that this was one of the most traumatizing flights that I've ever taken. Was 3.5 hours from Dubai into Kandahar. And of course, once I arrived, I knew I'd have to get back on that plane. And that was because there was only one way out of Kandahar, but I really felt it was important to record it because I think it's important for me as an artist. In my practice, I do a lot of self-portraiture, and so I wanted to make sure that I was included in my triage series of paintings. And this is my final slide of my images. This is the interior of the Hercules plane. And again, I wanted to show the absolute exhaustion of the military when they leave Kandahar. And this is the way they all came in, and this is the way they all go out. And I felt it was important to record this. It's these sort of simple moments, really, but I think they speak volumes. Quickly, these are just some studio photographs. And this is the cover of the book. One of the greatest challenges doing this series of military work for me, it's really, I ended up devoting 3.5 years to this body of work and to the promotion of it. And I think for all the artists, and I'm sure many of you here will appreciate this, is there's a great challenge in funding projects, in finding exhibition space for the work. And in my case, I made a book out of my experiences. Again, I was only able to do this thanks to my family, who were able to support me through my creative project. And my sister, who's a book designer, offered to design a book for me. My mother, I couldn't find a publisher. My mother funded the printing of this book. So the one thing I really hope that comes out of this conference is more awareness of the struggles that the artists go through to produce what I think is really important work, because we're telling important stories. And after all, I mean, it's the artists who are going to memorialize war.